So this is just an exercise to kind of get you used to the value coding that I've done for the heat map and to kind of ease into this process, because I know that kind of starting right away full color with the full warm cool palette, mixing all of that out can be a little bit daunting. So I wanted to have an exercise where we're just focusing on values, so you can kind of see that the value structure is what creates the form, and how the value system relates to the entire warm cool palette, that each column has that same value structure, the same value steps, and also approaching the mixing kind of one step at a time. So we're kind of mixing up these 3 initial colors first, and then kind of gradually adding on, so that you can start a project without having to mix the entire palette all at once.
The complete value study exercise is available as part of my eye painting course. This video is the first lesson where we paint a foundation of just 2 values, a light gray and a dark gray. Even if you don't continue on to add the rest of the value steps, practicing this kind of study with just 2 values is really helpful to capture the essence of a subject.
So I've cut a piece of the Stonehenge oil painting paper, and I've cut it to about 3.5 inches square, and I found a circle of, this is like a circle of canvas that's about the right size for the interior that I can trace around. So you can find a glass or a roll of masking tape or anything that's about the right size to trace around. So I'm going to trace around this, so I'm going to kind of center it and then just use a graphite pencil to draw the circle. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually putting tape on the back side of the piece of paper, and then I'm going to flip it over and tape, the overlapping parts of the tape to the easel. So now I have tape adhered to the back of the paper, so there's no tape sticking on the front. And one of the reasons I do this is that the tape, even though it's painter's tape and it's supposed to be low tack, it does lift up the paper, I've found. So like this, you can see I repositioned the tape and it lifted up a little bit of the paper from the back. So this way it doesn't tear any of the surface of the paper on the front. It's just on the back that happens. So I'm gonna put this down, and I may reposition this palette, move it a little bit over. And I have the reference printed out at the same size, about 3.5 inches square, so that I can kind of work site size just to make it a little easier to get the proportions right. But it's not necessary. The last time I did a study like this, I didn't print it out, I just had it over on my iPad. So it wasn't the same size or right next to the painting, and I was still able to get the shapes, but this just makes it a little easier for this initial block in. So when we're mixing a mid-value 5, we want to have 2 units of white and equal amount of black. We're going to be mixing up enough that we can then use this to make other mixtures. For value 7, I'm going to take 1 part of the value 5, and I'm actually going to take 3 parts of white. Value 3, we're just mixing from scratch. 3 parts black and 1 part white. Okay, I'll put out value 3 and value 7. And I'll go ahead and put out value 5 as well. The first thing I'm going to do now that I have my values mixed up is put out a little bit of oleo gel. And what I'm going to do, I'm probably not going to mix this in with the paint. What I want to do is oil out the paper. So this is Stonehenge oil painting paper, And I've found that it is a little more absorbent than other surfaces I've worked on. And there's pluses and minuses to that. There's benefits and disadvantages. A disadvantage to the paper being absorbent, and it is treated to accept oil paint, so it doesn't need to be primed. It can be just painted on directly, but it is still a little bit absorbent. So a disadvantage of that is that the paint tends to sink in, which means that the oil in the paint sinks below the layer, below the surface, and the paint that's left on top is a little bit underbound. So the only issue with this basically is that the darker colors will sink in. They'll look a little bit lighter and a little bit more matte than they would have when they're freshly painted, or if they were painted on a less absorbent surface. This happens to some degree with most surfaces that I use, but it will happen a little bit more with an absorbent surface. However, the advantage of having a slightly absorbent surface like this is I can layer new paint on top of the first layer without having to wait for it to dry. So that's what I'm going to be doing with this study. I may not paint the entire thing in one session, but I've done a previous study like this and it worked pretty well. So I was able to layer on top without lifting the first layer of paint up and without disturbing too much, the new paint that's going down. I didn't want it to mix too much with the paint that was underneath. And with this paper, it seemed to work pretty well. So that is an advantage when you're wanting to do this technique that I'm calling value stacking, where we're layering values on top of a more simplified value schema. So I'm going to oil out the surface partly so that the darks don't sink in quite as much, also so that the paint glides on a little bit more easily. So I'm just going to do the circle for right now. One thing about oiling out is that you want to make sure you're only oiling out areas that you plan to paint over. If I were to, for instance, oil out this entire piece of paper and then say that I didn't end up painting the outer edges black, I just left them the paper, this would yellow quite a bit. So as it dries, it will yellow. So you don't really want to be building up oil on the surface that isn't going to be mixed with paint at some point. And I just want to have a thin layer of oil on the surface, so I don't want to build up a lot of oil, just enough to help the paint glide and to compensate for any of the sinking in that might happen. And if I decide to paint the background later, go over it with black, I may end up oiling that out as well. But right now I'm just gonna kind of oil out the circular area. I have a couple of these synthetic filberts, and they're not super soft, but they're softer than a bristle brush, softer than a mongoose, but a little bit stiffer than a sable, I would say. Synthetic sable is what I usually use. So these are like a little more like the kind of nylon brushes that are a little stiffer than the sable brushes. And I just picked ones that I have on hand. I don't necessarily particularly recommend these brands or anything. It's just if you want to find something similar, these are what I'm using. One of them is a little bit narrower, and the other one is a little bit wider and has a little bit more of kind of a fuzzy edge, whereas this has stayed flat. So I think for the smaller area, I'm going to start with value 3. So I'm going to start with value 3 because it's darker, but it's also a smaller area, so I'm going to just use that slightly smaller brush. I want something that's, big enough to cover but small enough that I can kind of get specific about the shape. So I'm going to start with the darker color so that then when I'm looking at the reference, I'm looking at a dark and a light, the value 3 and the value 7. So the white of the paper now is standing in for the light. So I'm starting with the dark so that I can kind of maintain the same value relationship. If I were to do it the other way around, if I were to start with the value 7, the value relationships would be reversed and it would be a little bit more confusing to kind of match up the shapes. So I'm going to start with value 3. I'm going to get some paint on my brush and I don't want it to be really gloppy. I'm kind of brushing it out a little bit. And I think the first thing I'm going to do, I'm mainly going to be working with kind of mass drawing, so working with shapes instead of line. But I think that for this one, for the initial block in, I'm using the edge of my brush so it's kind of like a chisel shape so that I can get a little bit of a drawing in, and I'm just going to kind of, before putting lots of thick paint down, I want to try to make some marks to show where those areas of paint are going to go. So maybe something like that. The last time I did a study like this, I didn't do this part first. I just started massing in with larger areas of paint, and it worked okay, but I think I would have been a little more accurate from the beginning if I had taken a few minutes just to map out the shapes with line. So I'm looking at the negative shape and the positive shape. So thinking of the positive shape as being the value 3 right now, and the negative shape as being the field of value 7. And kind of judging how far away these marks are from the edge. Thinking about the angle. But I'm not going to be too picky about the drawing for this study. It's just to kind of get a sense of the values. So I just want to have a little bit of the proportion, be a little more accurate with the proportion. By doing this brush drawing first. And the paint glides on pretty nicely because of the paint glides on pretty nicely because of the oil that's on the surface. And if you don't have oleo gel, by the way, you can just use refined linseed oil. That's totally fine. So I'm looking at this shape, and then I'm looking at this shape. So kind of reversing the positive and negative to try to figure out how they fit together. I'm not really looking to make corrections with this technique. As far as erasing, I might be able to go in with a brush and kind of lift off some of the paint if I get it in the wrong place. But I'm painting pretty thinly, and I'm just planning to, if there's areas that got dark that aren't supposed to be dark, I'm just going to paint over them with the value 7. So eventually. Okay, so something like that is probably good enough for now. And then I'll go ahead and get more paint on my brush. Now, I don't want it to be really thick and gloppy, but I do want it to be enough to cover. So I have a good amount of all three of these mixed up. Right now, of course, I'm just going to be using the 3 and the 7, but I have a good amount mixed up so that I don't have to be afraid to, make the paint opaque, to get enough paint on the brush so that I can make my brush strokes opaque. But I don't want them to be gloppy or, too much impasto, too much sitting off the surface. I want the paint to be flat and a thin layer, thin but opaque. So that's the goal for painting today. So I'm gonna just kind of fill this in and maybe make some corrections as I see fit. Trying to use now I'm using the brush flat for the most part, unless I get into a very small area. And if I start to see something like that where it's not opaque, I want to make sure that I get more paint on my brush. And I'm kind of flattening the brush out and brushing it out so that I don't have a thick blob of paint on my brush. And around the edge of the circle, this is just a study, so I'm not too concerned about it being perfect. But I'll just kind of align my brush with the edge and do my best to paint inside the line. And I can use that tip of the brush kind of, again, as that chisel shape to work around the edge there a little bit. So some of these very small shapes, like the highlight, I'm actually going to leave that, I may leave that out for now and paint it on top instead of trying to paint around it. Because I'm really trying to work with the big shapes at this point. So anything that's really picky for the size of the brush that I have, I'll just leave it out until I start getting into more detail with subsequent layers and subsequent values. So I have my hand braced on this maul stick here. I have it resting, the top of the stick, it could be anything like a yardstick or a dowel or whatever, is resting on top of the easel. And then I just rest my hand on it to brace it like that. And I lost that little piece of light that's coming through, but I can bring that back later. All right, so I'm just gonna check to see if there's any ridges in the paint where, again, I want it to be kind of flat because I want to be painting over this with subsequent values. But for now, I'm going to switch to value 7, and I'm going to use the other brush that's a little bit fuzzier. And first I'm going to paint in the areas that aren't right up next to the value 3. Eventually I will be overlapping a little bit or painting up right up next to it, but because what I want to do is avoid mixing the paint together, so to some degree it will. So with this paper, it doesn't quite as much, but it will mix a little bit. So I want to start with, while my brush is clean, I want to start with the areas that aren't touching value 3. So I'm painting value 7 around the edges. It's kind of in the same way. And this, I also want to keep it opaque and flat, thin but opaque. It's another reason why I don't want to put too much oil on the surface. Just want to have a thin layer of oil on the surface because I don't want it to thin the paint out too much. Because basically the reason I want it to be opaque is that I want the value that I have mixed here to be the value that ends up showing on the paper. So I don't want to use the transparency of the paint. I don't want to be seeing some of the white of the canvas showing through, kind of shining through, because I want to be very specific about what values I'm painting. In this particular, for this particular technique and situation, there are other ways of painting that are perfectly valid where you do want the paint to be transparent and you want the white of the canvas to show through. But for this, I don't want that. So again, I'm just kind of, eventually I want these values to touch, but right now, I'm trying to not touch the darker paint. Now here, I may want to get a smaller brush for some of the details, because this brush has kind of lost it's gotten a little fuzzy. The bristles don't come together in a crisply anymore. So like for this upper eyelid, I don't think I can paint that with this brush. I'll need to go a little bit smaller. All right, so let me just grab a smaller brush so I can get in the eyelid there. So this is similar. This is a little bit of a softer brush. This is a Master's Touch Filbert. They're golden Taklon, which is kind of similar to synthetic sable number 2. So it's similar in shape. It's a filbert, but it's a little softer and a little bit smaller. Okay. So now I'm kind of using the edge of the brush rather than the flat to get in there. And now I'll go right up next to the value 3. So I need to push some of these shapes around. Now, as I'm painting, whether the brush is touching or overlapping the value 3, whenever I put paint down, I want to then, after that brush stroke, I want to wipe my brush off so that I'm not mixing the paint together. So I'm going to do my best to kind of adjust these shapes. Might have gone a little high, and this crease of the eyelid might be a little low. So I just wiped my brush off because I was painting, kind of overlapping that edge of the value 3. So I'm going to clean it off just by wiping it. I don't need to put it in the solvent. And here I'm going to push this up. And I lose a little bit of it, but that's okay. Because I can go back with a darker brush and adjust with the value 3. So I'm going to kind of be going back and forth between the 3 and the 7 now before moving on, just to get this initial 2 value statement to be as accurate as I can be. So wipe off my brush, get a little more paint. So these 2 colors are somewhat aligned with the light and the shadow. It's not exact, and it's not an exact match. Light and shadow is kind of a qualitative distinction. There are 2 different, 2 different entities basically, whereas the light and the dark are just quantitative distinctions. So it's just, basically the Photoshop is just deciding how light or how dark something is, whereas the light and the shadow is whether or not a surface is being, whether or not a surface has direct light shining on it. And sometimes things can be dark because they're, for instance, the eyebrow, which is, the pigment of the hair is dark. Even though the light might be shining on it, it may not, it may kind of group with the shadow. So I've pushed some of these shapes around, and I need to probably push some of them back. I'll just kind of go back and forth a few times. Not having done a very careful drawing, just kind of I didn't do a very careful drawing, I just kind of did a basic, I just did a quick block in, basically, so. Again, wiping my brush off after I make a mark. There, I try to bring back a little bit of that light. Wipe my brush off and get some more paint. Okay, I think I'm going to go back back to, let me just put this one. Go back to the dark brush. So it looks like this needs to come a little higher right there. Wipe the brush off. And the light on the eyelid ends a little bit sooner. Okay, that shape looks a little better. I need to push up that little bit of light under the iris. That shape was too wide, which makes sense because I'm using a larger brush than that shape really needs. This comes out a little further, I think. And this comes up a little bit higher. You can see sometimes the paint starts to mix, I can hear, so then I gotta wipe the brush off and get a little more of the darker paint. The eyebrow, I think it's a little more curved here. And it's a little thicker towards the tail end. So I think that this shape needs to be a little wider, the dark shape there, it needs to be a little wider. And now I'm going to go back to the light brush. And this needs to push back a little bit. And this needs to push up a little, just a little bit. And this too needs to push up a little bit. Make that a little cleaner. And back to the dark brush. I'm going to pull the iris out just a little bit towards the left. I think I went a little bit far. So back to the light brush. Again, it's a little bit of a back and forth. And you can decide how picky you want to be. You know, you might stop here. Or you could keep going and get it perfect. I think one thing I want to do is just fix the iris again. One thing I want to do is put in the highlight. Just push that light shape back a little bit. All right, let me get a smaller brush. So this is just also Master's Touch round golden tack-on, and this is an 18/0 brush. It's just a little round brush. It's not pointy anymore, but that's okay. So I'm going to take a little bit of the value 7 and try to figure out where that highlight goes on. I'm going to push that back a little bit with the darker brush. So something about like that. I'm just pushing that edge down a little. It's almost like sweeping the paint down. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. So now I'm gonna probably go in with the black and paint around the border. So I'm just using the ivory black, and I'm going to go in with my larger brush. Again, this is just a larger soft synthetic filbert, and it's the same one I used to oil out the circle in the middle, and I'm just going to oil out the edges also. That'll just kind of help the paint spread a little bit more easily and keep it from sinking in again, just like with the circle. Okay. So I'm going to take this filbert, which is a synthetic mongoose, and it's, you can use any brush. It doesn't have to be, I just wanted something a little bigger than what I was using for the eye. I'm just going to put that on. Again, there's going to be a little bit of transparency to it because ivory black is a little more transparent than any of these gray mixtures which have white in them. But I'm trying to paint fairly opaquely but not thickly. And I'm going to paint around the edges first, and then I'll go a little closer to the circle. And kind of rubbing it in a little bit to fill in the grain of the paper. So I think I got a little too much of the edge of that value 7 in the brush, and I was running out of black paint, so let me add a little more black paint. And I'm actually going to grab a different brush, one of these little filberts that I used for the value 7, just to get a cleaner edge around the circle. So it's not going to be a perfectly smooth circle, but it's close enough, I think. I just go back in with value 7 and push that out. And slightly crispen up the edge there. It got a little fuzzy, so I'm just going from both sides to crispen things up a little. Okay. I should probably stop now because trying to get this to be a perfect circle by hand right now might be a little bit crazy making. I just want to make sure everything's covered. So there's a little bit of white paper there, so I'm just going to paint that over with the value 7. Just giving you kind of a slightly easier introduction to the painting process, getting used to using the heat map and mixing the grays, which are kind of the foundation of the warm cool palette, before getting into working with the different chromas. I wanted to paint an eye kind of after the eye on Bouguereau's painting of the girl with the pomegranate, which I had done a drawing of that eye on toned paper. So this is basically a warm cool palette. This is just an easy way that I've found to get something very close to a base kind of useful skin tone mixture. Each column, all of the swatches in each column should be approximately the same level of chroma, amount of colorfulness. Each row should be about the same value, about the same level of lightness. And these are both the same approximate hue. They're both basically orange, just higher in chroma, lower in chroma. And then as it moves this way, you know, there's reflected light, and then even the crease is lightening up, so it's going to be more like a value 4. And it raises in chroma under here. It's actually quite chromatic, so I might want to go kind of stay value 4 and then kind of in between 4 and 6 in chroma. Let's just see. The white of the eye on the shadow side is closer to value 3. Sometimes the white of the eye, the sclera, is going to look cooler, so closer to neutral, maybe even shifting into blue. Sometimes it's going to look a little warmer, closer to the skin color. In the shadow, in this case, I think there's warmer colors bouncing from the skin, reflected into the white of the eye. So this looks quite dark as I'm putting it down, but hopefully once I abut it to the darker values that I've painted, that are, you know, even darker, it's going to start to look appropriate for that area. I'm going to start with value 5, chroma 4. So I'm looking at the heat map, and I need to get a little bit of the value 4, kind of bridge that gap. This far I have painted the eye with the warm cool palette, and what I want to do in the second pass of the painting is bring out some of the pinks in the skin tones a little bit more.